butcher's maze. It was a perfect early October evening, the kind that made you nostalgic for Halloween before it had even arrived. The crisp autumn air held just a hint of wood smoke, and the nearly full moon cast an eerie glow over the fields surrounding Wilburn's family farm. A group of 6 teenagers from Westbury High pulled into the dirt parking lot, piling out of Ryan's beat-up Jeep Wrangler amid a chorus of laughter and shouts. They were ready for an unforgettable night at Wilburn's famous corn maze and haunted trail. Or at least, that's what they thought. "Did you guys hear that the Wilburn place used to be an insane asylum back in the 1800s?" asked Brad, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his Letterman jacket. His eyes danced with a mischievous gleam. "No way, you're full of it," Jess scoffed, rolling her eyes as she sidled up next to her boyfriend Mason, lacing her fingers through his. Ryan smirked. "I don't know. My cousin went last year and said some really weird stuff went down. People getting separated from their group, hearing strange noises." "The Connecticut crop circle killer strikes again!" Zach broke in with a ridiculously over-the-top haunted house voice, waving his hands above his head dramatically. The others cracked up, and Jake hip-checked his friend. "You really need to lay off those cheesy horror flicks, bro." As they approached the ticket booth, a balding man with a dour expression and a faded Wilburn's Farms polo shirt stared back at them impassively. "Welcome to Wilburn's," he droned in a nasal voice. "Admission is $15 to go through the maze and trail, cash only." The teens paid and made their way towards the entrance to the corn maze, which consisted of a rough-hewn timber frame with heavy burlap covering the opening. A hand-painted sign above read, "You've entered the butcher's maze." As they ducked inside, Jess clutched Mason's arm and shivered dramatically. "Ooh, this is so creepy." Unbeknownst to the group, as they took their first few steps into the maze, a dark figure emerged silently from the corn rows behind them. Moving with skill and practiced stealth, it blended back into the stalks, waiting, watching. The maze was impressively elaborate, with tall corn stalks rising on either side and twists and turns that quickly left the teenagers turned around and disoriented. Eerie sounds piped in through hidden speakers, like ominous chanting, ghostly laughter, and the occasional guttural roar. Every so often, one of the group would let out a startled yelp as a contraption would kick on beside them. A passing ghoul, animated corpse, or grisly murder scene diorama. Despite their bravado, the fear and unease started to build. "Okay, this place is freaking me out. Where the hell are we?" Jess halted and spun in a circle. Mason wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders. "Don't worry, babe, I'm here. Just stay close and we'll get through this." They rounded another corner and found themselves at a 4-way intersection. 2 sharpened wooden stakes were crossed in the middle, with grimy strips of cloth dangling from the top. A sign affixed to one of the stakes read, "Go back," in what looked like dried blood. Hell no, we are not going back." Brad reached up and tore the sign down in defiance. "Finders keepers." He brandished it with a sick grin, and the others broke into nervous laughter. Taking the lead, Brad chose to go left at the intersection. As they moved forward, the rows grew closer together, and the atmosphere grew steadily more claustrophobic. After another twisting series of turns, they came to an abrupt dead end. Frowning, Brad turned to double back, but realized the others had fallen behind somewhere. "Guys!" He spun in a circle, suddenly hyper-alert. The hairs prickled on the back of his neck. There was no answer. Suddenly emboldened by fear, Brad moved back through the maze quickly, ears straining for any sound of his friends. Instead, there was only an eerie silence, punctuated by the faint groaning of the wind through the cornstalks. After wandering for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, Brad stumbled upon a new section of the maze he didn't recognize at all. The stalks were streaked in dark, wet stains, making them appear to bleed. Human-shaped figures dangled from crude wooden frames ahead, battered and lifeless. As Brad reached them, sickening realization spread through him. Those weren't dummies. They were real corpses. He staggered back, mouth opening in a silent scream. A large hand clamped down over his mouth as a thickly muscled arm snaked around his throat, cutting off his cries. "Shh! Someone will hear you," a deep voice croaked in his ear. It exhaled a stench of rot and decay. The others had long since come to regret splitting up from Brad. Without his brash overconfidence and sense of direction, as questionable as it may be, the group was hopelessly lost in the maze. "You hear that?" Mason cocked his head suddenly. The others fell silent, straining to listen. A piteous moaning seemed to drift through the corn, rising and falling. "It's just another one of their dumb scare effects," Ryan said dismissively. But Jess grabbed Mason's wrist, eyes wide. "No, that sounds like someone in pain. I think someone needs help." "Hang on, I'll check it out." "Stay here," Jake said. He handed his phone to Zach. "Use this for light if you need to. I'll be right back." He followed the anguished cries down several paths, eventually emerging in a crude clearing. What he saw made him freeze in horror. Brad was lying on the ground, shirt soaked in dark blood. A heavy metal post was sticking out of his stomach. Thick ropes bound his wrists and ankles. But worst of all were his eyes, wide and staring at nothing, iced over in death. Before Jake could even utter a sound, an immense hulking figure rose from the shadows behind Brad's body. Backlit by the full moon, it looked like something straight out of a slasher movie. An imposing silhouette in coveralls and apron, face obscured by a hood and burlap mask. One colossal hand clutched a viscera-stained machete. Jake instinctively backpedaled, shaking his head mutely. The killer started towards him with a grating metallic wheeze, dragging the heavy blade along the ground. Head pounding with terror and adrenaline, Jake turned and fled blindly through the maze, crashing through rows of corn. "Run! Oh God, run! He's real, it's not a gimmick!" he screamed, hurtling back towards the others at a dead sprint. They all startled and stared at him with wide eyes and pale faces. "What do you mean? Who's real?" Zach demanded. Jake grabbed his friend by the shoulders, breath ragged. "There's a real butcher out here. He killed Brad. We have to get out of this maze." He spun and pointed. "This way. Come on." The group pelted through the corn at a breakneck pace, fueled by primal fight-or-flight terror. Splintered stalks whipped at their faces and legs. They crashed through another burlap doorway into yet another area of the maze, desperate to make it to the exit. But as they stumbled into a new clearing, the scene before them made their blood freeze. Row after row of naked, mutilated bodies were strung up in cages from metal frames, rotted down to bone in some cases. The butchered remains of past victims, an entire grotesque human abattoir. A stench like hell itself washed over the group. Jess slapped both hands over her mouth to stifle her screams. Zach turned and immediately threw up what felt like everything he'd ever eaten in his life. Ryan and Mason stared wild-eyed at the corpse tableau, shaking their heads in numb horror. The distinct rasp of metal on metal sounded in the darkness. Out of the shadows behind the gruesome display, the killer emerged, raising his heavy machete. It caught the moonlight with a wicked glint. The burlap mask obscured his face, but his eyes burned with sadistic glee. "Time to harvest more meat for the butcher's larder," he rasped in a guttural growl. The group startled into motion, scrambling away as the hulking killer advanced. Ryan grabbed an abandoned rusted pipe from the ground and swung it with all his might at the butcher's head. It connected with a sickening thud, but did little to slow the monster's advance. The killer pivoted and backhanded Ryan away like swatting a fly. The teen went sprawling with a low groan, stunned from the savage blow. Mason charged next with a feral yell, grabbing the killer around the waist and driving him backwards. But the butcher's bulk and strength were inhuman. He simply shrugged Mason off and slashed at him with the machete, opening a deep gash in his shoulder. Mason crumpled with a scream of agony. Jess watched in frozen horror as the killer raised the blade to finish Mason off. Before she could even process what was happening, Jake barreled into the butcher, propelled by sheer desperation. He slammed the killer's wrist against the rusted metal of one of the hanging frames, knocking the machete free. It clattered to the ground and skittered away. With a bestial roar of rage, the killer swung his ham-sized fists at Jake in wild haymakers. One crunched into Jake's ribs, doubling him over with blinding pain and the sound of cracking bone. Zach grabbed the pipe Ryan had dropped and rushed in, cracking it across the back of the killer's knee. There was a horrendous snapping noise as the joint shattered. The butcher collapsed to the ground with an anguished bellow, grasping at the ruined leg. "Come on, let's move!" Jake shouted through gritted teeth, clutching his injured ribs. He and Zach hauled a barely conscious Mason to his feet, supporting him between them. Ryan staggered to catch up, Jess trailing behind as they raced through the shadowy maze once more, not even sure if they were heading towards the exit or deeper into its twisting guts. Behind them, the enraged cries of the killer echoed through the corn like the maddened screams of a wounded animal. They kept running, fueled by pure fear and desperation, until their lungs burned and muscles screamed in protest. Jess's heel caught on an upraised root, pitching her face first into the dirt in a tangle of limbs. "Ah!" she cried out as one of her ankles bent sideways at an unnatural angle with a sickening crack. Jake and Zach came skidding to a halt, panting heavily. Ryan doubled back, shock painted across his features. "Jess! Oh God! Oh God!" He cradled her head in his hands as she whimpered in agony. Mason groggily lifted his head, glassy eyes unfocused. What's happening? Ahead of them, one of the burlap entranceways loomed, the sounds of terrified screams and shouts filtering through from the other side. "That must be where the exit is," Jake said, glancing over his shoulder. "Maybe we can get help from the staff." But any hope was dashed as the towering killer burst through the corn behind them with a hellish roar, dragging his mutilated leg behind him. His beady black eyes burned with pure, unbridled rage behind the burlap mask. The group froze, looking on in abject horror as their tormentor advanced on them once more, unstoppable and inexorable. The grisly machete glinted in the moonlight, clutched in his immense fist. What happened next was a blur that would replay in Jake's mind for the rest of his life, like a corrupted film reel flickering on an endless, nightmarish loop. Zach, propelled by heroic if not foolish bravery, charging the killer head-on, the blade flashing down in a vicious arc, the wet, meaty thunk as it cleaved into his shoulder and chest, his crumpled body hitting the ground in a spreading pool of crimson. Ryan screaming in anguish, grabbing the pipe with both hands and swinging it at the butcher's face, metal crunching into the side of his skull, the pipe literally bending from the force of the blow, the killer merely flinching back then, raising the machete to hack deep into Ryan's midsection, opening him up like a butchered hog. Mason slipping from Jake's tenuous grip, dropping to his knees in a daze. The killer approaching with purposeful strides to seal their fates, staring into those hollow, pitch-black eyes through the burlap mask, the blade lifting high overhead to deliver the killing stroke. Gathering every last ounce of desperate strength, Jake grabbed Jess and dove with her through the burlap exit, crashing out onto the main path just as the machete cleaved down, slicing through empty air where they had just been. The boom of the killer's maddened screams faded behind them. Chaos and pandemonium erupted all around. Families and groups of terrified patrons sprinted in every direction. Jake's ears were ringing, adrenaline and shock numbing his body. His face felt warm and wet. Jess cradled against him, eyes rolled back and unresponsive. A familiar nasal voice suddenly cut through the din. "What in the hell?" It was the bored-looking man from the ticket booth, gaping in shock at the gruesome scene unfolding before him. "Call 911, Jake croaked, clutching Jess weakly as everything started to spin and darken around the edges. That was the last thing he remembered before blessed oblivion overtook him. When he finally regained consciousness, Jake found himself in a hospital bed, wrapped in clean white bandages with an IV in his arm. Bright fluorescent lights and the persistent beeping of machines made his eyes water. A gruff-looking state trooper in a rumpled uniform sat slumped in the chair next to his bed, hat pulled low. When he saw Jake staring at him groggily, he straightened up and cleared his throat. "Welcome back to the land of the living, son. You've been out for a couple of days." Jake blinked slowly, memories of that horrific night slowly filtering back like a merciless waking nightmare. What happened? "My friends. The butcher." His voice caught in his dry throat. The trooper sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his haggard face. "Son, you folks wandered into something straight out of a slasher movie. From what the paramedics could piece together, there was some sick son of a bitch dressing up like the Grim Reaper and murdering people in that corn maze. We're still not totally sure how many victims there are." Jake sat up with a start, eyes widening in panic. "Jess, she was hurt. She needs help. And Mason, Zach, Ryan, oh God." The cop raised a calloused hand. "Take it easy, kid. You're the only one who made it out. I'm real sorry. Your friend Jessica didn't make it. Lost too much blood from that broken ankle. The other 3 boys were killed too." Tears welled in Jake's eyes as a fresh wave of grief crashed over him, his body racked with silent sobs. He buried his head in his hands, coming apart at the seams. After allowing him a few moments to process the unimaginable pain, the trooper continued in a gentle tone. "We got an APB out on this psycho butcher freak. Every cop in the state looking for him. Don't you worry. We're gonna hunt this monster down and make him pay for what he did, you hear?" Jake nodded mutely, feeling hollow and empty inside. Nothing would ever make the guilt and searing loss go away. He was the sole survivor of the butcher's maze, and those scars would never heal.